Good evening and welcome. I'm Pierre Oddone. I'm the director of Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory. I want to thank you for joining us tonight for this panel discussion on ethics and science. This is the second event of a new joint speaker series that the university, together with Argonne and Fermi Lab, have developed. The purpose for this series is to provide an opportunity for the faculty, researchers, engineers from all three institutions to meet and to know each other, to develop friendships, and out of these conversations perhaps spark new connections and collaborations that in turn will fuel discoveries of the future. Last March, we had the first joint speaker event at the Art Institute of Science, speaker event called The Art of Science, which took place on the university campus at the Oriental Institute. And feedback from this event was very positive, and people expressed the desire that this should continue, and we're doing that tonight in this vein. I hope you will enjoy the evening with good food, drink, and great discussion. Before I get started, I would like to recognize Don Levy of the University, Vice President for Research in National Laboratories, and Eric Isaacs, fellow director at Argonne National Lab. You wave your hand so people know who you are. Good. So at this time, I would like to invite the moderator of tonight's panel discussion, William Schweiker, director of the Martin Marty Center, and Edward Ryerson, Distinguished Service Professor of Theological Ethics in the Divinity School of the University of Chicago. Before he introduces our panelists, we've asked him to say a few words about tonight's theme, ethics in science. Please give a warm welcome to William Schweiker.
Thank you very much. We have gathered today in this lovely and historic space, as you've just heard, for the second of the joint speakers events run collaboratively with the University of Chicago, Argonne, and Fermi Lab. And this is possible because of the leadership of these institutions, which I think we should thank right now as well. And welcome to each of you for coming this evening. I must say it's a special honor for me, as one who labors in the field of ethics and also religious studies, to be asked to speak and moderate this particular event. We have a distinguished panel of speakers, renowned and accomplished in their fields. You can see in the programs. Let me introduce them, and then we will pause in a few minutes to let them each say a few words after I engage in some opening reflections. J. Michael Millis is the section chief in transplant surgery, medical director of the Transplant Center, and professor of surgery at the University of Chicago Medical Center. Chris Quigg does theoretical physics at Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory. Pam Sydelko is the Deputy Associate Laboratory Director for Energy Engineering and Systems Analysis, long title, at Argonne National Laboratory. Another long title, Philip Hefner, is Professor of Systematic Theology Emeritus at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, former editor of Zygon, a very important journal on religion and science, and also served as the founder and original director of the Zygon Center. Now, as I noted, in a few moments, each of these speakers will offer some brief reflections, and then we'll turn to open discussion among us, and finally open discussion with you as well. But I've been asked to give a few moments of reflection on the topic before us. I've told the organizers that I've limited my remarks rigorously to 2 hours. Now, the topic of this meeting actually reaches back into the history of Western thought, and yet continues to derive public debate and research in our own times. Socrates, the so-called father of moral philosophy or ethics, sought, as he put it, to bring philosophy down to earth in order to consider the conduct of human life, how we should live. Ethics, in this comprehensive Socratic sense, which we're adopting for this evening, has to do with the proper conduct of personal and social life, including scientific inquiry. But while Socrates and his followers distinguished ethics from what they called natural philosophy, that is, inquiry into the basic elements and structures of the universe, the question of the relation between science and ethics remains. If science is a system of gaining knowledge through observation, experimentation, and theory in order to demonstrate, describe, and explain phenomena, can ethics be a science? Conversely, if science denotes any systematic field of study or the knowledge gained therein, then clearly ethics is a science, but so too art and religious studies and the like. For the purposes of our discussion this evening, we are using a rather broad Socratic definition of ethics and a more precise, let's call it modern, conception of science found in the natural and social sciences. But even in that case, the question continues in our day when there are attempts to isolate, for instance, the biological roots of morality, or to clarify the cultural and moral background for the rise and flourishing of what we now call science. Our discussion today, then, is actually one moment in an eon-long debate that has been around then for an awful long time, because at its core is the question of how, if at all, knowledge, that is, knowledge of the universe and forms of life and the human world, should and can inform the conduct of life. Or conversely, are the norms and values that guide human conduct somehow different than or beyond scientific knowledge? Obviously, as our opening video demonstrated, there are ethical values in the practice of science. But our topic also raises the more complex and pressing issues of the connection between knowledge and values, thought and action, the purpose of science itself. In this light, it seems to me that there are four broad areas of inquiry begging for collaborative research, and I'm hoping we can get some collaborative research on these things. I want to note these, and then we'll turn to our speakers. First set is under the rubric of science and the origin or grounds of ethics. As we've seen historically through the last century, clearly if not before, there have been challenges to claims that moral values and norms are grounded in the will of God or the gods, somehow grounded in the nature system itself, as if nature has a moral purpose within itself, or third, grounded in some universal principles of human reason or sentiment. But those were, historically speaking, classical ways of talking about the origins of morality, moral values, and moral norms. But each of those classic accounts of the origin of morality have now been challenged in the modern world. Does that mean, then, that morality is purely conventional? Or can a new inquiry into the origin of ethics be undertaken collaboratively between those working in moral philosophy and the various sciences? Second, ethics in the practice of science, as our video noted. Here are issues about the norms and values needed in the work of scientists, and so the values governing the use of means to attain the ends of science. But there is also the question of the ends of sciences themselves. What are the goods, or what is the good, that we seek in scientific inquiry? Is it a moral good? Consider the motto of our own university, Crescat scientia vita excalator. Let knowledge increase so that life might flourish more to more. What do we make of that? Does this university still affirm that motto? That's a question posed by this kind of symposium. Now, behind these first two questions are deeper and more vexing ones. Consider these. Are moral values objects of knowledge? Are they real? And if so, in what sense? Does our knowledge of human biology and sociology contribute anything to judgments about how we ought to live, let alone the discoveries of recently in physics? Conversely, while it is obviously true that we do not want personal bias or ideology to infect scientific inquiry, we want to be able to wear that magical ring that Dan Sulmazes was speaking of. Nonetheless, are there values and norms intrinsic to science itself, not just the practice of science, intrinsic to science itself, without which science fails, scientifically and as a moral enterprise? Finally, we are prompted to ask, everyone who works in ethics is prompted to ask this, so you'll have to excuse me. We have to ask the question, so what? What is at stake in our age in how we take up and answer this question as intellectuals working at high-powered universities and research centers in a very powerful nation? These questions relate to global problems of ecology, disease, the seeming clash among cultures which have different understandings of science and morality. What answers can we give to these? The so what question. Well, enough of my initial musings. Hopefully you've seen, in the way I've outlined this, the scope, the urgency, and also the excitement of our topic. And with that in hand, we can now, thankfully, hear from our panelists. I'm going to pose, this is all preset, folks, you should know this. I'm going to pose a question out of their own reflections in order to have them each reflect on our topic for just a few minutes, and then we're going to move into open discussion, okay? So Michael, if I may, who works on transplantation, a very pressing issue not only in our own culture but around the world. And this raises the vexing problem of what is the relation between what we can do medically and what we should do? And what is the relationship between need and supply in your own field in medicine?
Well, thank you very much. It's certainly daunting to follow William and his very erudite comments. They were written out, though. So
I'm a text person.
and mine's are just impromptu and freehand. And I will get to those. I want to make a few comments on the video first. One is, and I know Daniel and have had meetings with him and discussions with him, so I hope he doesn't take this the wrong way. As surgeons, we have to strive for perfection all the time. And Daniel's comment that we want scientists to be like the ring of Gyges, well, he gave us two characteristics. One, invisible, and two, having an affair with the queen. And I'm not sure we want that part of the perfection in the invisibility of the ring of Gyges. And then the second, and this really gets to the question you asked me, the other comment was from the agronomist, I forgot your name, but I see you right there, who commented that they get funding from the government, from the taxpayers, and that they owe certain aspects of their work to the government. Well, we as transplant surgeons have the same issue. We wouldn't be able to do anything without donation. And those donations come, by and large, from society. When they've had a loved one who has died either from a traumatic event or a cerebrovascular accident or other illness, and they make the decision to give to society their loved one's organs so that others may live. And so we have the same issue. We are bound to make sure that we do the right thing. Because if we start doing the wrong thing, we lose that support, and then we help no one. And so we can do many things, and we have chosen limits to those things. The University of Chicago was the first university hospital to perform a successful living donor liver transplant. We just had the 20th anniversary celebration this past year. And that was a huge step in terms of helping children who, by and large, had no access to many organs, and many of them died. and by being able to take a piece of liver from usually a parent and giving it to a child, dramatically change the life of those children and the life of that family to have a child that was able to live. On the other hand, we have chosen limits for that. We do not do it in situations in which the risk to the recipient, i.e. that they would probably die even if you did the operation, we choose not to do that. Similarly, if it's too much of a risk to the donor, we choose not to do that. So it's not as if we cannot do that. We could do that. That would be the easy way. The hard way is to say, to set limits. And during that period in the early, mid-90s and later in the 90s, there was lots of discussion, including one of those 48 or 24-hour Dateline things, in which there was a scene in which I'm evaluating the angiogram of a liver of a potential donor for a child, and it wasn't suitable, and I chose not to use it, and my disappointment was caught on the tape, and I got a call back immediately from my mother. Why did you say that word on national TV? But so we choose to have limits in transplantation for a variety of reasons. Probably the most important, as the agronomist points out, is we have to have support from society.
Okay, very good. One of the things we're trying to demonstrate is that the ethical questions differentiate into different sciences. And so while there are common concerns among all of us, there are specific issues that arise in particular the sciences. Chris, would you like to turn? The question I had for you is, what is involved in discerning, particularly in your field, discerning those opportunities to do good within the sciences? And do we need to open up our very understanding of the sciences and ethics in order to address those kinds of concerns?
In 25 words or less.
In 25 words or less, yes.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm just a poor physicist from a small town, so I have rather practical ways of thinking about these things. And I'd like to begin by talking about the conception I have of ethics in science and in physics in particular. The phrase itself elicits thoughts of bad behavior, fraud, sloppiness, misrepresentation, misappropriation, and therefore the injunctions against it. So don't lie, cheat, or steal. First, do no harm. Avoid self-delusion. Luckily for us in physical sciences, you can't fool Mother Nature, so it's fruitless to make up things. And don't be evil has become popular. So these are laudable rules of what you might call quality assurance in the practice of science, and they're indispensable to good science. But I see the issues of scientific responsibility and integrity as broader and more affirmative than just not doing evil. And it's also easy to give examples of these. So give credit where it's due, share your ideas, create opportunities for others, seek recognition for deserving colleagues. So these are a set of imperatives, affirmative imperatives, but they're also just a beginning. It's our obligation to give thoughtful and enlightened attention to the humane uses of science, to the risks that attend new knowledge, and to assess the power and limitations of scientific knowledge as it applies to public policy decisions. This is something we may get into in more detail. When it comes to the ends of sciences, I like a pronouncement of the quantum physicist Niels Bohr, who said that the goal of science is the gradual reduction of prejudice. We approach that goal not only by accumulating new scientific knowledge, but by welcoming all the members of society into the company of scientists and the scientifically aware. And for me, one of the highest delights of doing science is working with others, women and men from many different places and conditions who share similar passions and similar ideals. The strength of science, it seems to me, lies in its provisional nature, its open-mindedness, and its capacity for doubt and uncertainty. You can't gain new knowledge until you acknowledge that there are things you don't know. Richard Feynman wrote of the scientific spirit of adventure, the adventure into the unknown, an unknown that must be recognized as unknown in order to be explored. To summarize it, humility of the intellect. And this may be our great lesson for humanity at large. Now, a lot of these things seem like choices between, binary choices between good and evil, but of course, part of the difficulty of living ethically is that many decisions are complicated, call for subtle judgments. And let me just tell you about one thing that I've found difficult over the years. Occasionally, institutions that I have loved have been on the wrong path, and I have called attention to their problems visibly enough to incur the wrath of the establishment. But when the authorities were unresponsive, I held back from bringing down the temple. Because if you love institutions and value them, there are limits. Well, those limits can translate into careerism or inaction and so on. In many of these cases, I feel that I should have done more, but if I'd done more, I might have done real harm. So there are things to agonize over there. Also, I'd like to close with the thought that in institutions such as ours, ethics and science and the need for such complicated judgment calls reaches beyond the scientists. So one thing that I've noticed recently is that my laboratory increasingly publicizes research results and even speculations before the scientific community has evaluated them. Now, sharing the adventure of science is a worthy goal, but it's complicated to figure out what are the standards for balancing the risks and rewards of such openness and propagation of things. So I stop with that.
Thank you. Pam, if I may. The whole question of the relationship between basic and applied sciences and the cultural values and relationships between those are particularly vexing in research institutions. And I imagine you have a few thoughts on these kinds of things.
Argonne is one of those institutions that really has its roots are basically in the basic physical sciences, but it has a good deal of applied science too. We're a multi-purpose laboratory, a very multidisciplinary laboratory, so we really look at, a real long pipeline from all the way from the basic sciences to the applied sciences, and then eventually to technology transfer. And having that complete pipeline does cause stresses in the system. So in my context, I'm an applied scientist, and so I have, over many years, had many different research sponsors who would expect results that are answers to questions. And that's what I'm comfortable with. I'm comfortable with the concept of milestones and tasks that are pretty finite. My colleagues in the basic sciences come more from a culture of being funded to do discovery science, to increase knowledge. And so their product and their impact would be publications of sharing knowledge. And the way that they would get that success was from their community, from their peers, and from refereed journal articles. From my side of the house, it's publications, but it's also patents, technologies. It could be a report to a sponsor, a policy report. And so there's a little bit of strain in the system for what is the impact of science. There's different cultures in the laboratory. We don't always see eye to eye. Recently, and I'd say in the last 2 decades, it's been more and more that society expects to see results from science. They want to know what's in it for them. And they don't necessarily understand that pipeline. They only want to see the end. What's coming out the end is what's going to mean something to them. They don't understand that the basic sciences are so important because we don't have that knowledge. We can't innovate all along. So the stresses are becoming more and more, I think, with the funding being decreased in the basic sciences, and more expectations for quick turnaround, quick innovation. And those innovations don't happen just from vapor. They happen from the basic sciences all the way through. And so I'm just seeing that in our current situation, and I think going forward, I think we're going to struggle with the funding. It's public funding, it's government funding. Should it be industrial funding? I mean, should we look at private and public both? But we're facing these things in a lot of the national laboratories, which are really focused on trying to bring these things together and trying to do applied, service to the country, but also looking at, well, where are the roots of that? And I don't have an answer to that, but we are struggling with that.
Yeah. Thank you. And Phil, could you say a little bit, since you're working with outside of the sciences, in a sense, and interacting with them, about the social and cultural contexts as you see them, and particularly notions of well-being that might be important for thinking about the purposes of scientific inquiry itself?
Thanks, Bill. and thanks to all the members of the panel. I wish I could hold everything you've said in my mind and integrate my comments with it, but I can't. When we look at the socio-cultural context of science, I'm impressed by the fact, and I think this does tie into some things that you said, Pam, that the fundamental or basic science and applied science are inseparable and inextricably interwoven. Some of the great pioneers of modern science in 17th century England said at the outset that the purpose of science is to improve life. I think that's very relevant today because science and science-based technology, and they're frequently difficult to separate those two, although some people I know want to keep them very separate. Science is deeply embedded in our culture, our society, so much so that it is fundamental to practically everything that we want to do. And today we're very much dedicated to the proposition that the world should be made a better place, especially in our society, that life should be improved. And of course, the way we do that is largely, significantly, through science and science-based technology. So I think that this makes science fundamentally an ethical and moral enterprise, at least for society and for its social embeddedness, because the questions like, how can we make the world a better place? How can we improve human life? Are questions about the good. And whenever you ask questions of the good, what should we do? What would be the best thing to do? What should we not do? You're talking morality. And the science of morality is ethics. And I think that that is a very neuralgic point today because science is, we're creating the world and we're creating ourselves in the world. We're not only creating the world around us, but a good deal of the life sciences is devoted to improving us as human beings. One figure I like is that I don't like it, but it's vivid. In 2008, in the United States, $12 billion was spent for 10.2 million cosmetic surgery procedures. Practically all cosmetic surgery procedures, although Mike might question this, but as I see it, have in mind improving life. Sometimes in an almost trivial way, sometimes in a way that touches on our personal survival. But it's very difficult to ask the question, are we creating, or to answer the question, are we creating the kind of a world we want to create? Are we creating the kinds of human selves and persons that we want to become? Very difficult question to get hold of because it's so big. But there aren't any questions that are more urgent. Interestingly, one of the scientists in the video said, and this would be marvelous to spend a whole evening unpacking, he said, the scientist has to take ethics very seriously, but the ethics, of course, will not alter the direction of research. Well, I think that's precisely the issue that we're facing today. Of course, the statement that ethics will not alter the direction of research is itself a value-laden statement, right? What happens when we have not a conflict or just a tension or a divergence of opinion on values? One might ask today, is that $12 billion spent in the best way when it's devoted to 10.2 million cosmetic surgery procedures? And we don't have to pick on cosmetic surgery. We could we could ask the question, is it really the thing to be doing today that we should enable every citizen the possibility to watch their favorite TV programs on their smartphones? That's a very sophisticated, complicated, expensive accomplishment that's based on a lot of research and technological development. Is that really the way to go? There's nothing wrong with it. Just like I wouldn't say there's something wrong with cosmetic procedures. That's quite different from asking, is that the way research and applied science should be directed at this point in our history in order to make our life the best possible, the world the best possible, and our lives in it. In my own religious and theological work, this imponderable question that is so difficult to get hold of consumes an awful lot of my attention. And when I watch TV, the news, when I read the news, when I keep up as a layman can in science with scientific journalism, scientific articles, this big question, this imponderable question pops up all of the time. And of course, when we get into issues like energy, you know, the different scientific approaches to the energy issue and the technological approach, when it comes to the public discussion in the political realm, it's a cats and dogs fight. It's not a genteel argument about which scientific work seems the most promising or which technological application seems the most feasible. Cap and trade is either the way to salvation, or it's just another tax that liberals want to burden business with. The truth claims in the issue don't get discussed in public. They get discussed in the arcane circles that one of the scientists talked about. I'm just going to leave it there. That's the sort of thing that comes to my mind when I approach the topic ethics in science.
Well, thank you. I want to try to mix it up a little bit now. Given that we, as Pam noted, are in a social environment and a cultural environment within the sciences, basic and applied, in which there is increasing pressure for results, and yet, as Phil just noted, real ambiguity about what we would mean by enhancing life or flourishing, and yet there's still the demand for results, very specific results, but also the assumption that particularly the applied sciences are going to contribute something within the social arena. How then do we address the kinds of questions that Chris and Michael were getting at? How do we think about the limits on what we should do and also the goods that we want to forward? I'd like to kind of go back and forth on this because it seems to me there's an implicit tension between the need to establish limits and the actual cultural and social situation we find ourselves in when there is so much pressure for results that will have some impact on what we vaguely think will be the enhancing of human life or social life. Yes, Michael, please. Let's have this as an open discussion now, please. I can be done moderating.
Sure. One of the aspects that caught me, made me remember some comments made by a famous Department of Surgery chairman at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, Franny Moore, and when he was discussing surgical advancements in ethics. And he framed it in the climate of the institution. And what he noted is that if the goal was for personal aggrandizement, institutional fame, financial rewards, those types of motivations, then the institution was no longer fit for surgical innovation. And it's the same issues of reward that we were talking about, and the publication of findings that may not have been validated yet. We really need to make sure that we have the right motives for doing what we as surgeons do and doing innovative surgery, or the research or the publication. The motivation has to be correct, not just because we think it will enrich us with a patent or make the institution more famous, et cetera, we have to be doing it for, in our case of surgical innovation, for the patient.
I think one of the things that kind of complicates this, especially in a national laboratory that is public funded by agencies and departments that have a lot of control really over what they are funding and what they want out of it. You know, it used to be that there were more opportunities for basic scientists to get block funding to do kind of what they want to do, or to do the research in an area that they think would be, you know, interesting and create knowledge. And that's,
If I can interrupt, under the assumption that sometimes pursuing a line of inquiry will give rise to goods that one can never even conceive of.
Right.
Result, right.
Right.
And so if you try to control,
right.
yes.
And it wouldn't be that they'd have to worry that it has to be a result, but just the knowledge itself, knowing more about our physical world has to be better, right? Because just knowing about it could result in an understanding that could help us, but just knowing about it was the reason. I mean, I have a lot of friends whose really their motivation is just knowledge discovery. That's what they love to do. And so I think that because we're now being asked by our funding agencies to actually carve that more into a boundary condition that makes us want to say, well, there has to be a reason for it, because Congress is going to ask us, what are we doing? And I think it's those stresses, it's not that we have the complete freedom to say, well, I will just do what I think is right ethically and the science that I want to do, because in the long run, then you may get your funding cut. So, you know, it's competitive. It's in a competitive world because the resources are constrained, and we love doing the science. I can tell you that when I get onto a team of people who are trying to solve a problem for energy, I mean, there's a lot of fun. We love doing it, you know, and so we want to continue doing it. And so there's this stress in the system to say, well, what we think might be the ethical thing, and to do the right thing may not be what the funding agency is asking, not always. I mean, sometimes it aligns greatly, but you know, you work for Department of Defense. There's ethical questions about where your research might go, but you don't really have the control over it if you accept the funds and you've decided that you will deliver what you've put into your contract to deliver. You really don't have a whole lot of, well, I'm just going to go off and do what I want to do.
So the issue is not just whether the scientists can wear the ring of Gyges or not. It's the fact that scientists and institutions are embedded in larger social structures that are placing immense pressure on their capacity to even wear the ring, right?
I think so. In the last 20 years that I've been a scientist, I've seen this pressure increasing. And I think it used to be that we'd have that more of a balance, where the knowledge creation would happen. And I'm not saying that it was perfect. It wasn't like that everything that could have been transformed into applied sciences got there. I mean, I think there is a lot we're trying to work on to get those two cultures together, because the cultures are different enough that if we were working together more, we'd get more innovation. But it used to be so much more of a balance, and the balance is a little off now, I think.
What do you think is driving that? Others can jump in here. I'm just fascinated with this line of inquiry.
I have a
Chris?
close-
Yeah, I'd like to distinguish two elements. One is that the agencies over the last 5 years or so, in order to pursue the laudable goal of rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse, which is easy to cheerlead for, have called for more accountability. And their response to accountability, or their way of implementing accountability, has been to structure things, structure research programs, and to fit them into projects to the extent possible. It is conceivable that this guarantees that you deliver what you promise. I'm not sure. It is certainly true that it all but guarantees that you will never deliver more than you promise. And what's been lost a little bit is the need for a responsible amount of inefficiency. I used to tease Carlo Rubbia, Nobel laureate, former director of the CERN laboratory, that if he'd been a better manager, the World Wide Web never would have been invented, because he would have fired those guys from doing it. And there are all sorts of examples of basic research projects that have led to innovations that change our lives. You know, the laser, for example, done by some atomic physicists in the 1950s, revolutionized printing, among other things, and wasn't the result of a crash program to improve the efficiency of printers. So that's one aspect. This what I think is a somewhat misguided and over-structured implementation of the laudable goal of accountability to respond to not thwart the will of Congress, as they like to say. There's a second element, and it bears on what Pam has been saying. First, I'm not certain that in this time we find an unparalleled emphasis on applications and deliverables. My experience is that you can distinguish between basic research, applied research, and then development leading to products and stuff with permeable boundaries between them. It's my experience that in science funding, there are waves of fashion, and the people who get pinched in the middle are those in the middle, the applied scientists. And so there are epochs in which applied science is sort of squeezed away, and then it comes back, relaxes to a better state, maybe even over-relaxes and so on. But I'm not sure that we're being, even though all of us here can see clear societal needs that we think will be served by science, I'm not sure that the pressure coming from the government is really much more intense now than it's been at other times in our history. So I think we shouldn't develop a persecution complex about that.
Pam, do you want to?
Well, I'm not sure that it's intentional that there's a dislike for the basic sciences or somehow we're trying to root it out. I think it's more of when it comes to limited resources, it's hard for taxpayers to understand, so it's hard for Congress to vote for large budget funding for things that their constituency maybe doesn't really understand the immediate impact for. Now, I'm not sure that that's pervasive across all the research across the whole nation, but in the context of what I've seen our basic science program being squeezed, not having the funding that they used to have, and in some ways being asked to put more constraints on. I think it's a good thing. My personal opinion is that use-inspired basic research is a good thing because we're in a position where we're behind in innovation. I believe we're maybe not behind yet, but we will be if we don't continue to understand this pipeline. So other nations are putting a lot of effort into this, and they have not lapsed in the basic sciences like we have done. So the pipeline is still flowing for them, and we've got a dip, right? So we have to catch up. And so I think the idea of use-inspired research is to do accelerated innovation, to try to push that system so it has a little bit of an engine and it's not just a flow, right? We want to push it a little bit. So putting the basic sciences into a context of saying, if you could do a new material, if we could just at least bound it a little bit to say, if it was materials that could handle cold temperatures better. Properties of that, not telling you have to create a certain material, but could you do your research in a way that would look for materials of that certain nature because of a need? That's kind of what's happening, I think, and for some of the basic science guys that I know, that's great. And then for others, they're not happy with putting constraints because they've kind of gotten used to the purity of the knowledge. So, and that's my experience in the laboratory. Now, again, in other laboratories that are more single-purpose basic laboratories, you may not see the stresses that maybe we're seeing in our laboratory because of the differences in the pushes and pulls of the different funding.
We see other stresses.
How do you account for that when you say that other countries are putting more into basic research and we're drawn away from that? How do you account for that? Do you have any explanation for why the United States is in that kind of a situation?
I for one thing, is in the last year, I've given presentations and shared experiences with, let's see, Chinese, Koreans, Russians that come to the laboratory to ask us about how do we do technology transfer? What are our relationships with universities? They're trying to learn. They're rapidly trying to improve their systems. We never have anyone else come in. I've not had an American contingent of universities come in and ask, so I'm not sure what that doesn't answer your question, but they seem to be so much more understanding that innovation and economics and prosperity rely on science. They do seem to really understand that they have to put that effort, the resources, and the time into it. I'm not sure if our country really has lost that. I'm not saying it's lost, but I just see a trend. I kind of see a trend that when we have economic problems, people are wanting to know that money is being spent to something they can see immediate gains out of.
I think what we're dancing around is the complicated questions of the limits on inquiry. And we have to understand that as the way we've been differentiating it here, Michael started this, and we have to see it as a deeply ethical question, because the issue is, how do we direct the power that we have to act in the world, to change the world, to respond to reality and understand it? But what we're seeing here, I think, I'm going to test this idea out and see what folks think, is that that question of limits is very difficult to make sense of in a culture like the United States where limits are not liked. Let's be honest, right? Where there's constant pressure to overcome any specific limit, because limits are always seen as negations rather than as directions, right? And furthermore, this question of limits becomes even more complex in the sciences, because do we really want to say that the pursuit of knowledge should be limited? And under what conditions? I just heard Pam and Chris going back and forth in terms of that social cultural issue within your own disciplines. But I was wondering if any of you thought more. I mean, Michael raised this originally, but I really think this is a fundamental problem within the topic for this evening. How do we think about the proper limits on inquiry, not as a negation, but as a direction for how human powers and capacities can be exercised? That was very clarifying, wasn't it?
Well, there is certainly an element in our society that would like for their own religious or cultural values to forbid certain lines of inquiry, as in stem cell research. So there are lines people would like to draw. There are things that I'm sure none of us would do, even though we might not want to have rules imposed on not doing them from the outside. So yes, there are limitations.
How do we think about those as scientists and as humanists and people in the social studies? How do we think about the meaning and grounds of those? Michael, you've wrestled with this a lot, I think.
Yes,
so.
yes, I have. As you noted, started out with this and saying that we do put limits on things that we do. We have over 100,000 people waiting for organs. We do 20,000 transplants a year in the United States. In the liver in my field, it's 17,000 waiting for a life-saving organ, and we do about 6,000 a year. So we have a huge need, and we have set limits in regards to the sources of organs. And I like to think of it as we set reasonable limits, and hopefully those limits will inspire other areas of investigation and inquiry so that we solve the problem in different ways. So for patients with liver disease, since we have set limits and patients are dying, we need a liver support, liver system, something similar to dialysis that will support the liver, so that we don't have people dying. We have people on a machine, and we need to investigate those areas. So the way I look at limits is that they can be inspiring in other ways, and not looking at them as a way that we are destined to have patients continue to die.
Mm-hmm. But you're suggesting then that, at least in your own field, the question of limits is not exhausted by supply or by the market in organs or by preferences, back to some of the questions I think Phil was pushing. But rather, we can think about these in terms of the way they may spawn new research, new concerns.
Right.
So there's another area, which is who owns science.
Yes.
This comes up as universities increasingly make pacts, alliances with industrial concerns. It's particularly acute in your subject of biomedical research, where there are horrible things that happen, in my view, of drug company representatives ghostwriting papers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It seems to me totally unacceptable, but it happens. There are things that are more subtle, and I wonder if you or others have comments on the remarkable book by Rebecca Skloot on the HeLa cells, Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which raises the question of what's done with the discarded body parts that we leave you when you test our blood or do other diagnostic procedures. Who decides who profits? What is the nature of informed consent, and so on? It seems to me that that's replete with very great questions that need careful thought.
I agree, and I think that I don't agree with the prevailing thought that is when we as researchers get cells and we have this little piece of paper that says we hand over the rights to anything to the institution, that is okay. I'm not in that camp. I think that we do have a responsibility to whoever donated that to have some level of acknowledgement, and that the person who donated it may not want any financial compensation. They may or they may not, just as in my field, people provide organs as a gift, not as an expecting of a reward. And similarly, you know, people who give cells, et cetera, ultimately may not want financial recognition. They may want just the recognition that they provided a gift. But I think that I personally believe that they should be allowed that opportunity, and not what is the current prevailing thought is that they sign and away all those rights when they sign that piece of paper.
Let me see if I can push Chris and Phil to engage in something here, because I think Chris just mentioned something that we have to address, and that is this question of the purposes and limits of scientific inquiry in our now cultural context in the United States and globally finds itself at the crossing point of clashes between different cultures, different religious traditions, different visions of the world. Phil, in your comments, you noted quite rightly that there are deep underpinnings within the enterprise of science that are culturally and socially funded. But how do you think about the clashes that are now arising over this precise topic of thinking about the limits of scientific inquiry? If you see what I'm getting
Well, I
at
think
here.
if I understand you,
because that then exceeds the question of institutional purposes or the market or so on.
well, some of those values are so deeply embedded in the culture. I've been close over the years to things happening in Germany, and you know, Germany, because of their World War II experience, were really inhibited from talking about human genetics. Not just the scientists, the theologians.
Right.
Theological discussions of the nature of the human being never got into genetics. And it wasn't until the 80s that the first Max Planck Institute for Human Genetics was brought into being. Of course, they've gone like gangbusters since then, but the culture, certain Muslim traditions have, some of them are quite open, some are not. Our own in the United States talk about stem cells and certain things that have to do with reproductive medicine and technology. I really don't know how to handle those, because some of those, and I'm sure you people on the panel have more experience than I do, but those sorts of values are so deeply rooted that they aren't really, much of the time, they're not amenable to reason. They're not amenable to education. I remember I was once invited to Northern Michigan University to give some lectures, and a biology professor came to me and said, you know, I've got a class full of people who want to train to be nurses, and none of them believe in evolution, but they're taking my course and they're going to pass it and they'll get approved to be nurses. She said, I need a religious authority figure, that was me, to go into the class and tell the students, it's okay to study evolution. You don't have to be afraid of it. Well, now, that's a very knotty problem. They're going to study the biology, they're going to learn enough to pass the tests, maybe they'll even be superb in their professions, but basically they don't accept one of the basic premises of what they're doing. Even a university education is not changing that. This is, and I don't know what, maybe Michael knows more about this. I never did find out what really brought the Germans to the point where it was okay to have an institute on human genetics when they had resisted it for so long. But I think they require a lot of attention, that requires a lot of attention, and it's hard, but a lot of sympathetic feeling our way into that situation to try to understand it so that if we think it ought to be changed, we'll have a better chance of changing it.
So did you feel unclean after giving those reassurances?
Well, I thought, well, you know, maybe I made just a little teeny contribution to changing a cultural value. I have to be very modest about that.
We really need to think about the force of what was just said. Do we want to be led to the conclusion that the fundamental orienting values of cultures are non-rational?
Of course,
I think this is one of the deep questions our topic for tonight poses. This is where science and ethics are involved in a very deep question. Are the fundamental values of our culture, which manifest themselves in terms of the kinds of results we want, what we think about well-being, how do we understand things like transplants, what are the goods and values that direct actual scientific inquiry, are those finally resting on an irrational set of commitments in a culture or not? Now, maybe that's an overly philosophical question for this evening.
Think that the Faustus myth, Dr. Faustus, has been a very powerful element of popular culture in the West for 600 years at least. And that's one answer to your question.
Yeah, exactly.
Dr. Strangelove is still easier for some people to latch onto than a sophisticated and balanced understanding of the role of nuclear physics in our society.
I'm always reminded in this context of in the inside of the Museum of Science and Industry, around the cupola, is written the following words. I mean, it's very emblematic of that time, but also of our own time as in terms of a question, and it states, and this may be back to the basic and applied sciences, science discerns the laws of nature and technology applies them to the good of man. Right? Is that the vision that and how can we defend, if we want to defend such a view in our current cultural context?
Well, if it was that simple.
No, it's not that simple. Why, Pam? Why?
Well,
y'all ought to look at the motto of this building when you go out as well. It's very interesting connections. Yes.
Well, I think we've mentioned nuclear. I mean, nuclear is one of those things, in my opinion, that our country has an irrational, opposition to. And I don't know if it's, 3 Mile Island or if it's Chernobyl or I talk about my generation. I hear the word nuclear and I immediately see the vision of a mushroom cloud because when I was a kid, that's what we constantly saw, and it was something that was made to be a very scary thing. And so now I work with these nuclear scientists and engineers who are absolutely the best in the world. Our laboratory has some of the best people. And they have to go overseas. They're looking at trying to find funding overseas in order to advance their science because we can't seem to quite get past it here. And so, again, I think it seems, at least when you think about it, it seems so irrational. You get so frustrated because you're like, we think it would really benefit our country. We think that it's safe. We know that it's safe, and we know that it's clean, and it could solve some energy problems, but yet, it seems like you just can't get past the word go. So this whole concept of what, and maybe it's just the scientists, saying, oh, they just don't understand, and that's probably being elitist. But it is frustrating because you feel like it's an education problem, or it's a problem with the public or the media. There's all these other constraints that are on trying to get the truth of what we think they should know about out there. given the politics and given the media, it's a difficult message to get out.
Well, in these days, the German government, decided to extend the life of their reactors another 20 years, and riots have broken out in some areas, and I read an article in Der Spiegel today that asked the question, are the German protests of the 70s and the 80s going to come back? And Chancellor Merkel is under intense criticism for caving into the nuclear lobby. That I would say is the epitome of irrationality.
Michael, you want to?
Yeah, so Phil, you asked me a question about the Germans and genetics, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer it. I certainly don't read your Spiegel. I think Pam answered it for you, though. It's the same irrationality of Germans and their history of World War II and genetics issue with, as Pam described, the irrationality of the U.S. using nuclear power, nuclear energy for badness, if one wants to,
or stem cells,
or to kill people, that we now say nuclear energy is bad. Same irrationality.
Yeah.
And it can be irrational, but the folks who are out there firmly believe it. It's not like you can really say to them, well, they really do believe it, and it's so difficult when you have that. Really.
How do universities and national labs deal with irrationality?
Isn't that part of our
Yeah, we have it all the time.
So it's not, the force of this is the problem is not only whether you can wear the ring within your own little research institution, but your research institution is set within a culture that has certain values and so on that themselves must be probed. And the notion that we could somehow exempt science from that kind of question I find very difficult, actually. But Michael, were you going to jump in?
Well, yeah, so as physicians, we deal with irrationality a lot. And
I bet.
Unlike us undergraduates.
well, and as transplant surgeons, we deal with irrationality where it may be a life or death issue. And in some situations, you just have to accept the irrationality. You're not going to change that person's mind about this area, regardless of how much you talk to them, how much you try to give them scientific data about this, that, and the other. They're not going to change their mind, and that's just it. So how we deal with it, in some ways you have to accept it.
I would be interested in a study of the hospital, medical center, and the labs of the belief systems of the individuals that work there. Some years ago, I was a theologian for a day at DuPont Labs in Delaware, and they set aside
Just for a day.
a few hours where they gave me an office and announced that anybody could come in and talk to me. And that was the first time I learned that, and most of their research was on medical testing. They pioneered, I guess, in testing for AIDS. And for the first time, I realized that creationists could get PhDs in science and work there. And I'll never forget one man who had a PhD in biology. He was focusing on tests for AIDS. And he said, I believe that it is the will of God that I do this research. And I said, oh, how do you see that? And he said, well, we know that AIDS is a scourge caused by sinful people and that God condemns it. And when I work on better ways to test, then we have a clearer picture of just who God is condemning and who God isn't. And this is in the heart of one of the great labs of that time, at least. I don't know how it stands today. And I came out at the end of that day very glad I'd had the experience, but my head was just spinning.
I'd just like to say, somebody sent this to me today, and it follows right on this. It's the headline of this article is, "God Will Save Us from Climate Change." A U.S. government congressional representative said that today. So he is is believing that he should be put on the Committee for Energy and Commerce, but he believes wholeheartedly that because of when God said after the flood he would never destroy the earth again, that we can trust that climate change is not going to be a problem.
This is the force of what I was suggesting earlier, that our topic raises the question of the origins of ethics itself and appeals to the divine or the gods, appeals to nature as if nature has written into it a moral purpose or even the structure of human reason. And I think taking that very seriously in our context is extremely important. I should give you all a last chance to say something before we open it up to our crowd who's been very patient and listening to us go on. Is there anything that you all want to pick up before we turn it over to the crowd? Chris, you
Well,
like-
yeah, I just, we've been talking about very serious things and deep responsibilities here, but it's important to recognize that being able to choose what you think about and to solve problems and understand something about the way the world works and then tell other people about it is a wonderful life.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. One of the things I hope you've seen is that a good question opens up into many, many avenues, which is what we've been trying to explore here. And now you all have been very patient, so I can raise questions to you as well, but it might be just as boring as my raising questions. So let's see if anyone in the audience has particular things they want to. I'll try to recognize folks. We have someone here and then over here. This lady right here? Yeah.
Hi.
You might want to tell us who you are and your major or
Sure.
what you do.
My name's Debbie Kwok. I work at Argonne National Laboratory. I'm a computer scientist at the Advanced Photon Source. In my previous careers, I've worked in R&D in the oil industry. Also, for waste management, I've worked in research for them. So I have a varied background and kind of nervous here. Very impressive panel. But I'd like to address a question to Chris, if that's acceptable. And you intrigued me by your statement that how do you know when to hold back from bringing down the temple? And scientists are usually very aggressive and assertive and passionate about their work, and I think for the most part the same is true for ethics, and sometimes it's hard to know when to push hard and when to pull back. So if you could expand on that idea of how do you know when to hold back?
18th century religious thinkers called this zeal. And we have to worry about too much zeal.
Yeah, I'm not sure you do know when to hold back. You're convinced that you're right, or that your way of seeing the problems is the correct way to do it, and that great harm will come to the institution if they don't pay attention to your advice about how to change and improve. And yet, if you go too far, you can shake everybody's faith in the institution, and then it's in a weakened condition. So when the people in charge won't listen, that gives you hives. That's all I can say. These have been for me, luckily, only a few moments, but moments that are much more difficult than any judgment I've had to make in my own research or in the protecting young people or things like that. There, the issues are pretty clear. But here, I've found it a challenge to know how far to go. And as I say, I've regretted not going further, but been aware of the fact that had I gone further, I might have caused greater harm.
There was a gentleman over here, I believe.
My name is Maurice Ball. I'm a mechanical engineer at Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory. A question to the entire panel. What do you think capitalism, the essence of capitalism, has an effect or impact on the ethics of science?
It's a difficult thing to define what the essence of capitalism is to begin with, but I think one of the issues that I heard being addressed is that demand for results, the manipulation of preferences about what folks want. Phil was making the connection between, maybe a very ironic connection, between cell phones and cosmetic surgery. but nonetheless, those are in part market-driven, right? So, at least from my own perspective, insofar as science is one social enterprise that is nested in other social mechanisms in our culture and society, such as the market, right? We have to think about the interaction between them. And it's not surprising, I think, you all may disagree, that oftentimes market values are driving a lot, that the tail is wagging the dog, as it were, from my perspective. Others might.
So the point there was, what is the essence of capitalism? And I will translate that into my field as areas that we have wrestled with extensively. And on the campus, we have people who are zealots, both ends of the spectrum, in terms of markets for organs. There are some on campus who believe that developing a market for organs is absolutely fine, okay, and the right thing to do. It saves lives, it saves money, it does a lot of good things. And we have similar people on the very opposite end of the spectrum and saying that that is absolutely the wrong thing to do from a social point of view, from commoditization of body parts and of people, and we should never do it because it gets into areas of ethics and morality and everything else that are just wrong and wrong and wrong. And so we have that clash on campus. We have that clash as a organization of people who do transplants, and you know, so we have that influence. We don't have the answers necessarily, but we have the influence, and we have discussion about that. Usually every year, and every 5 years it kind of comes into a crescendo and then perhaps calms down a little bit.
You know, I find it that I keep not answering questions but posing more questions when I try to answer questions. But one thing I think that's kind of interesting related to capitalism is recently the multi-billionaires of the world have started to kind of get together and say, well, what can we do to use our wealth to do things good, right? And so there's a lot of things that are going on now where they're really trying to do good.
Yes.
But there may be some ethical questions that will come out of that because they're using their wealth. In some cases, they can use it as a carrot or a stick to do what they think maybe needs to be done, and who are they to say it needs to be done just because they have all that wealth. So that's an interesting thing I see kind of evolving.
I would just add on to that. I, at least in the medical field, when I see many of these very wealthy people trying to do good, it's a much more targeted way than it was in the early 1900s when we had the industrialists. And at least looking back on it from 100 years hence, it seems to be that philanthropic giving was more non-directed and funding a scientist and do whatever that scientist wants to do, rather than now. I mean, if you're not in the healthcare field, if you're not doing infectious diseases or something similar to that, you're not going to get any Gates money. Period.
Right. As opposed to them putting money towards like MacArthur Foundation or Brookings Institute, where it's more that particular more objective body would then take your funding and put it where, maybe a committee was deciding that.
Yeah, I think we have an obligation as scientists beyond our own self-interest to try to explain the difference in medicine between basic science and public health, basic applied research and development in the physical sciences and so on. It's worth trying to treat people like grown-ups. You mentioned
It's frustrating as it.
You mentioned members of Congress having difficulty explaining to their constituents why they support basic research. I found that members of Congress are very adept at acting a lot dumber than they really are. They will often ask you questions that sound terribly hostile, hoping that you'll give a good answer that they can then give to their constituents. And it's true that in their 4th of July speeches, the reason they give for supporting Argonne may be to keep the North Koreans out of the gates or something like that. But they know better, and I suspect that many of their constituents know better as well. And I think it's important for us to engage with them as grown-ups. Just a word about Maurice's question. I think, of course, it's a very vast question, as you well understood. There's nothing wrong with us having to answer the question, what have you done for us lately? We are taking money from my 91-year-old mother, for example. We have a responsibility to the people who contribute our support. But I think we also have a responsibility to try to help them frame the scorecard in a way that is not simply beneficial to us, but reasonable. To ask not just for a product, but for new things. You talked about directed research aimed at a material that will do this or that very well, and we need some component of that. But graphene didn't come from that, right. And who knows what that's going to do for us, for example. So to try to explain these things, I think, is quite important and one of our responsibilities.
Yes, in the back here.
Yes. Okay. My name's George Mosho. I'm from Argonne National Lab. In my field in health physics, a major philosophy is the discussion of risk and benefit. And although it's been kind of touched on with respect to the medical aspects that were brought up earlier, could you discuss a little bit ethics with respect to risk and benefit?
You mean in terms of, are you asking the question in terms of moral theory?
Yes, yes.
Well, now I can bore you all very quickly because we're into moral theory. This is oftentimes seen as a form of what is called utilitarianism or consequentialism, in which the principal forms of analysis are means ends reasoning, and in which the good, the end that should be sought, is the greatest good for those involved in a particular decision making, whether that be all sentient beings, logically speaking, on our little planet, or in some particular context. The difficulty with this is that the desired ends may sometimes override what we would commonsensically think we owe to individuals in the process, right? In other words, if you're always interested simply in reducing risks in order to attain certain benefits, what are you willing to sacrifice in order to attain those benefits, right? And so most folk, many, this is a big debate in moral theory, but many, such as myself, worry a little bit about the logic of such utilitarian reasoning. Now, I don't know if that's getting to your concern or not, but as soon as we put things in the logical form of risk-benefit, we're on I'm suggesting we're on a logical train where we then have to talk about what we're willing to sacrifice in order to get those benefits. And the sacrifices may be something that we would actually find, if we used a different logic, a bit repugnant, such as organ donations or the harvesting of organs or the selling of organs to attain a certain benefit, okay, in order to avoid the risk of certain kinds of death or disfigurement and so on. Is this at all on your question, or have I completely missed the mark?
It's a part, it's not the whole. There are other aspects to it as well, but that's an interesting side.
Okay.
Let me try another aspect of it. When we do something that we've never done before, or that has never been done before, we should think carefully about the consequences and the risks associated with that. I'm happy to report that the CERN laboratory has now collided heavy ions.
And we're still here.
We're still here. Black holes and strangelets did not consume the universe, to the chagrin of the Democratic Party. We knew there was no reasonable probability of such a thing happening. Had we had a hint that there was a chance that some really bad event should happen, that would have been a real conundrum and something to think about very hard. It didn't come into play in this case because the horror scenarios were so completely outlandish and made up. But it is something that you could imagine having to face at some moment. And it would call for serious reflection.
We have someone back here who's been waiting patiently. Yes.
My name is Hugh Lippincott. I'm a physicist at Fermi Lab. So my question was getting back to the previous topic, which was basic science versus applied science and justifications for both. and I'm going to try and think if I can formulate the question appropriately. But in my experiment, I'm looking for something which has no possible applications of any kind whatsoever. We're looking for dark matter, which, if it exists, will never ever hit a human being ever. So, to me, I have a very hard time saying, give me money to look for this stuff, because maybe there'll be some spin-off application at the end. And so, it's all about human understanding. And so there's the argument that human understanding in general is a worthwhile goal. And is it ethical for me to say, and maybe we'll find some other stuff which is useful, which has certainly happened in the past out of basic research, but you can never make a promise of that kind of spin-off. And also the uncertainty inherent in doing basic research in general is something that I don't think we, as scientists, publicize enough. That sometimes we're not going to find the right answer. And I'm sure this happens, say, in a medical situation as well. I mean, some tests are inconclusive, and what do you do in that situation? So that's not really a question, but...
Do more tests.
Yeah. If I may, you see, your question and the difficulties you're having, quite rightly, with the way it's put, rests upon the precise kind of utilitarian logic I was getting at before. That we ought to understand things only in terms of their outcomes or their benefits. And I already noted I have some difficulties with that logic, and we can see one of the practical implications of that in terms of your very theoretical research. Should everything be determined by the specific outcomes we think we can bring about?
The other half, of course, it costs $10 million
yes,
to
I
make
know.
an experiment, right?
Yeah, then that becomes a prudential judgment in a particular context when we have as many people involved in the decision-making.
The Bears spend more than that on a bad
Yes,
quarterback. So.
exactly. Let's get some perspective here. Yes,
Hello.
sir.
Hello, my name is Herman White. I'm a scientist at Fermi Lab, and I grew up in a town called Tuskegee, Alabama. And in my lifetime,
Yes.
and certainly in the lifetime of my parents, there was a scientific experiment that was done on human beings.
That's right.
And I want you to address the question about the greatest good for the greatest number versus absolute ethics with regard to what should or should not be done.
Yeah, thank you very much. I gather that's directed to me or to all, particularly, I think, also to Michael.
Well, why don't
Yes,
you
please.
start off?
No, you go ahead. You go ahead. I bored constantly, so please. Yeah, please.
Yeah, we'll fight over.
Yeah. Actually, I don't think we'll fight. We'll see.
No. Well, it is clear that that was a seminal event, and for those who perhaps don't know it, there was human medical experimentation on people in Tuskegee without consent. The kind of the least common denominator there. And clearly it was changed the way medical experimentation, medical research, clinical research was conducted from that point on. It's in my value system, and the value system I think that most of us in the medical field have grown up with since then. There is no good at the end when the process is incorrect.
That's right. I would agree with that. Not only this particularly horrific set of circumstances in Tuskegee, but also, and this is some of the background to some human rights discourse now, certainly Nazi doctors as well. What was forgot is that in a process of trying to seek certain ends, there are certain absolutes that should not be violated, such as human beings. Right? So one of the reasons why I have difficulty with a utilitarian type of logic is that it too quickly can miss that stark and real point, that there are certain things that should not be done to human beings. Now that raises a whole set of other ethical problems about how you talk about those rights, how do you give an account of those, and so on and so forth. I would rather deal with those problems than the consequences of something like Tuskegee. We have a gentleman over here and then over here. This gentleman's been waiting first, and then we'll go into the back.
This is really related to the same
okay.
question. What about paying people to volunteer to participate in experimental.
So, I'm sorry,
What about paying people to engage in, yes.
Yes, another issue that transplant gets into extensively, and once again, similar to the answer about capitalism, and I translated that into markets, the concept has been that in transplantation that the donation is truly a gift and shouldn't be paid for. And that is still a very strong principle espoused by all the transplant societies. I work as a consultant for the Vice Minister of Health in China, and we're trying to regulate and transform the transplant system in China. And one of the issues is that currently there's a black market for organs in China, and if we were to develop a system that is regulated, if there wasn't some money provided for those people who are voluntarily providing organs at the time of their loved one's death, whether that would really be looked at as, could have gotten X amount of money if we had donated prior to death, and now there's death and there's no money associated with that, and whether that system that we're trying to develop would in fact eliminate the black market, or would it continue? So the issues come about as an exploitation of the poor, and we can once again, as Bill described before about the values and what we can or shouldn't do to humans in relationship to those arguments. It's the same with what you defined as poor and how exploitative that is. And those are issues that there aren't any good answers for right now. As I mentioned, from the economic point of view, there's every reason to pay people for organs. There's no question about that.
Absolutely.
But from the point of view of what we should do with humans and at what price, that's another issue.
Yes, absolutely. We have time for one more question, I think. This gentleman here?
Thanks. So I'd like to go back to the question of transparency and ownership of information. I'm a geneticist in the clinical diagnostic lab at the university, and we're currently generate a lot of genetic data and are on the cusp of generating loads and loads more. And in my field, there's a real anxiety that if you release this information, most of which we cannot currently interpret, that people will end up making poor decisions about their own lives. And this is not basic science information, this is specific information to particular individuals. And that somehow we are responsible down the line for the poor decisions that these people might make. So I guess the question is, as a buzzword, transparency is a very laudable goal to get behind, but even in that, there seems to be pretty substantial ethical challenges. So I'm hoping that we can get some responses on that.
I think a graphic, if I understand your question, it's really touches on what we're about, because it is what is the ethical responsibility of education itself? We disseminate knowledge without having any clue of what others will do with it, right? The most horrific example of this, in my judgment, in the history of the U of C was Leopold and Loeb, who took a course and read some Nietzsche and decided to go out and kill someone to prove that they were part of the Übermensch, right? So the question there, it seems to me, is what is the extent of the capacity of the teacher or the researcher to anticipate possible ill uses of knowledge, while also granting the freedom of those who receive that knowledge to exercise their own life. We don't want to take away from human beings the burden of their own existence. That would be deeply immoral itself. So I think as much as possible to be clear about the possible consequences, the possible upshots, the possible misuses of information would be important. And that would be true, it seems to me, not only in research, but in all teaching. I don't know if anyone else.
I was going to maybe look at it a little bit different. You know, in terms of transparency, I'm not sure what you're being transparent about, because you don't know what that really means at the current time. And so I'm not sure it would be any more valuable than a computer scientist showing me a bunch of ones and zeros. I wouldn't know what that meant. You know, perhaps they would. A set of random ones and zeros, probably they wouldn't know what that meant either. And that's more of what the information you're gathering. I was actually thinking that when you were starting to talk about that, going more towards something that was discussed earlier, and that is industry and the biomedical industry and what they are doing with their samples. So anytime, in general, a pharmaceutical company does a clinical trial, they're getting samples, and they are, I know for a fact, doing genetic analysis on every sample. They may not ultimately do anything with it specifically, but they are getting that genetic information and running their drugs over similar issues and figuring out which ones are working for this type of patient, which ones are not. And where that value and transparency is for that and the bigger, you know, for the patient as well as the industry, I think are huge questions that as big as the UFC is and the hospital and your clinical lab, it is a fraction of what the Pfizers and the Mercks and, you know, SmithKline have access to.
Yeah, there's a whole complex of questions that have to do, especially for publicly funded research, that have to do with making available data. Sometimes people say that the data should be public. I think that this is a complicated set of issues for which the answer will be different in different fields. One of the things to contemplate is whether you're being paid to accumulate data or to produce science. And you know, there's a difference between data preservation so that it can be looked at retrospectively and making everything available to people who might not be able to make any sense of it. And we do have responsibilities to preserve data, especially data that can't readily be replicated. But exactly in what form that takes, I think it bears a lot of thinking. And as I say, I think the answers will be different in different subjects.
Well, I want to thank our moderator, Professor Schweiker, and this very lively panel. I think I'm going to be driving back to Fermi Lab and probably not falling asleep thinking about half the issues that were raised tonight, and provoke a lot of thinking and a lot of further ideas about how to approach these issues in society that are very important. I hope you all enjoyed this evening and were stimulated by the discussion. I want to also thank the people who planned this event and welcome you to join us downstairs for dessert and refreshments. Thank you so much.